Okay, I think, Hannah, are you still on? Because we know it's very late for you in, um, in Sri Lanka.
I am still on. I am
Yes.
still on, Stephen. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
and
Yeah.
thank you so much for your patience. So, without any further ado, we will turn it over to you to give us an update on Sri Lanka. Please, Hannah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Good afternoon to all of you. So earlier today, the development and humanitarian partners in Sri Lanka launched a humanitarian needs and priorities plan. We are calling for approximately $47.2 million to provide life-saving assistance to 1.7 million people, or 30% of the impacted population. The HNP was a direct response first to the situation, but also it was a response to the government of Sri Lankan request for United Nations-backed multi-sector international assistance to respond to the most urgent needs arising from the recent crisis. Currently, Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis since independence. This crisis has serious consequences, particularly for food security, for agriculture, for livelihoods, and access to health protection and education. Now, the humanitarian country team estimates that nearly 5.7 million people are now in need of humanitarian assistance. The HNP is highly prioritized. We have really made a big effort to focus and prioritize on the immediate life-saving initiatives for the most vulnerable and most affected people over a 4 month period. Our goal is to prevent a humanitarian crisis later in the year and to bridge to development and socioeconomic interventions. So the HNP will focus on the three sectors. First is food security, nutrition, agriculture, and livelihood as one sector. Second, on the health sector. And the third is on protection and education. On food security, an estimated 4.9 million people, or 22% of the population, are currently in need of food assistance. Import restrictions on chemical fertilizers introduced last year, but since then withdrawn, has greatly impacted the crop and plantation sector. So, for example, the paddy production has dropped by half, nearly 50% really dipped just from one harvest. Now, and it's likely to be even more impacted in the current season as well, with only 24% of the farms have been able to be planted due to acute shortage of basic agriculture inputs of seeds, fertilizers, etc. Food inflation in Sri Lanka in May was 57.4%, making food items out of reach of the most vulnerable families. Surveys conducted by humanitarian partners are already showing a large proportion of the people affected already using coping mechanisms such as selling home furniture, borrowing money. And 95% of people affected have already reduced their food intake. These mechanisms are not sustainable over time and will lead to greater losses, as you can all imagine. Now, to address the immediate food and nutrition needs and protect and diversify the livelihood of the most adversely affected households, the HNP is calling for $34.5 million. On the health sector, Sri Lanka's once strong healthcare system is now in jeopardy due to the shortage of foreign currency. So we have over 400 pharmaceutical drugs, 5,000 essential surgical items, and 1,000 laboratory items will be out of stock between now and the end of July. And already we have been out of stock of several other pharmaceuticals the last couple of months. And in April, the Ministry of Health issued a memo recommending rescheduling all routine and non-urgent surgeries and procedures, owing to the extended power cuts, the lack of medicine, and fuel shortage that has really impacted the island very badly over the last also couple of months. Now, for the provision of vital and essential medicine, medical supplies and devices, the HNP needs $8 million to fulfill the needs over the next couple of months. Finally, the burden of the current crisis is disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. Issues with access and pricing of essential foods is affecting the government's ability to provide basic protection for the most vulnerable. For example, the current government budget only provides for 3 months of the National School Meals Program. In normal times, this program fulfills up to 1/3 of a child's daily nutritional needs. At the same time, while we're noticing there is an alarming increase of high-risk child protection incidents and pre-existing forms of gender-based violence and discrimination, and the inequalities, the gender inequalities have exacerbated in the current crisis. Now, Sri Lanka used to pride itself on the enrollment and completion rate for primary and secondary education, one of the best in the region. However, affected schools are now struggling to stay open, especially with the shortage, again, with the power cuts, with the shortage of fuel, etc., impacting, as we can imagine, the out-of-school children and putting the children at risk. Vulnerable communities we are noticing more and more, the data is coming that the impact on vulnerable communities is really increasing. To address these needs, the HNP is calling for $4.8 million to provide services that address gender-based violence and child protection, as well as safeguard education. As you might know, Sri Lanka was progressing very steadily towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But the current economic crisis threatens reversing many of these gains, including the peace dividends. The enjoyment of basic human rights to food, to adequate health, is at stake to many, and this could ultimately, knowing the history of Sri Lanka, impact the social cohesion as well. So intervention now will help prevent a much larger humanitarian crisis later in the year. We must act now to support the production of food so that people have enough to eat. We must protect livelihoods so that people can continue to make a living. We need to scale up nutrition intervention to avoid seeing babies in the hospital suffering from acute malnutrition. And vital and essential medicine that are out of stock have to be procured and quickly to avoid easily preventable death. And we cannot afford to let children fall into the abuse or violence. So this is really the time to show solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka, because if we don't act now, we will see Sri Lanka slide into a humanitarian crisis. And the world doesn't need yet another humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Hanaa, thank you very much. First question to Edie Leder, Associated Press.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you for doing this briefing. I'm slightly confused. Is this $47 million appeal in addition to whatever the humanitarian appeal was for the year for Sri Lanka, whether there was an appeal earlier in the year for the entire year? And is this in addition, or is this a brand new appeal?
Thank you. Thank you. No, we never had the humanitarian appeal in Sri Lanka before, at least during the last few years. We go through what we use UN Strategic Development Plan. This is the first time we go for a humanitarian needs and priorities plan. So this 47.2 is new, and it is focused on only intervention over the next 4 months to as a preventive mechanism to avoid the humanitarian crisis.
Okay, and have you gotten any signs of donations yet? Have any donors stepped up?
We got some interest from. First of all, I did the launch this morning in front of all the development partners. We do have an interest from the Australians. The Australian government has already contributed since last night. We see interest also from the diaspora, the US. From the diaspora from the US, they have also expressed interest. Japan is also interested to contribute. So this appeal is open not only to government, but it's also open to private sector, corporate sector, and individual contribution as well.
Okay, and just a follow-up question on, there's a very serious political economic situation in Sri Lanka, as you were talking about. Is the government, the new government, I guess, supporting this appeal?
Very much so. We embarked on this appeal based on the request from the Prime Minister for an international assistance, considering the grave situation that the economy is in, and the health sector and the agriculture sector is in. So he had requested and sent the request to the Secretary General, and also another request to the Director General of FAO. And before, the day before yesterday, before I launched the appeal, I went and also shared the draft appeal with him as well.
We'll go to the screen. Iftikhar Ali, Associated Press of Pakistan. Iftikhar.
Thank you, Steph. My question was partly asked by Edie, but I will ask another one. Thank you for this briefing. Apart from such factors as COVID, war in Ukraine, and climate change, what else caused such a grave situation in Sri Lanka, which was a pretty stable country? Was governance a factor in this?
The crisis of this, in the crisis for this nature, there are a number of compounding factors. The secondary impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, of course, and the immediate impact on tourism, and the tax cuts that were introduced shortly before its inception have greatly affected the government revenues for various reasons, and affected the sustainability of the debt load accumulated by the country over the previous decade. But then you have the ban on the import of chemical fertilizers imposed by the authorities between April and November in 21, has caused a dip in the paddy harvest by nearly 50%. Now, the country's current account deficit has widened while its foreign exchange reserves have dwindled, resulting in a dramatic currency devaluation, rising food prices, and a food shortage. The economic crisis has been also indirectly worsened by the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine on already elevated global food and energy crisis. But just to follow on what what you're saying, Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So I am here today not to talk about who to blame in the economic crisis in the country. I stand in front of you today, and I mean, if you follow my tweets, you will, you know that I'm fully, following the situation, and I always raise lots of issues. But today I stand in front of you as a humanitarian. I'm here to talk to you about the very real impact this crisis is having on millions of ordinary Sri Lankans, many of whom suddenly are struggling to put food on the table today. So that's how.
I understand.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Hannah, thank you very much for staying up late for us. Please thank you and your team, and we wish you all the best and hope to welcome you back here soon.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.